Hello again. Today I'm making a color study for an upcoming painting here. The technique is a la prima as with the previous one. I'm working on an ACM or aluminum composite material panel and it's primed with acrylic gesso. So the question is, what is a color study? I've mentioned it many times in previous posts, especially on Instagram, but I realized that maybe not all of you are that familiar with the concept. So as the name states, its purpose is to study your subject basically, but it's like a preparatory work phase where you use your reference to create a smaller painting, usually in a looser manner, in order to find out if you can actually make the painting work. So ideally you have already thought of your composition and decided on it, and now you're about to test it out. Even if you haven't, it's a good way to test it out, even though there might be some more efficient ways to do it, like in charcoal for example. So in my opinion, it's good to figure out all the light and dark shapes and do they actually look pleasing before moving to the color study stage. This can basically be figured out already in Photoshop or Lightroom, or assembling the objects of a still life if you're working from life, etc. Not necessarily drawing it out. What color studies are really good for is actually figuring out if the painting works as a whole when painted, since paint as a medium does have limitations. Sometimes you simply realize that the idea you had is not that great of an idea in the first place, and as such it's good to call quits on that one. Sometimes it takes you actually painting it to find it out, and in that case it's of course better to use something like a cheap surface, a small surface, and less painting time and paint wasted on the whole project if it's not gonna amount to anything in the end after all. Now that's a bit of a negative way to view the subject, of course. Your goal of course is to create a study for a nice large painting that you can then be proud of. Now what you want to figure out is of course how you can pull off things such as very bright areas in your painting, very dark areas in your painting, and very colorful areas in your painting, as these can sometimes be limiting factors when you're using pigments on a two-dimensional flat surface instead of looking at your bright monitor screen or something that is very vivid in real life, such as petals of a colorful flower that have light shining through them. In these cases it can be, for example, with the petals, that the color is very vibrant and at the same time the color is very light compared to its neighboring colors, and we don't have a pigment that is almost as light as pure white but still very yellow, for example. And these are the things you must study in the color study, on how you can pull these things off and make them look very good in a painting. One way of making these things work is of course toning down other things nearby. For example, in the case of my color study here, I have some street lights, which of course are light sources and as such should be very bright and indicate that in the painting. However, they do need contrast to appear that way, and sometimes you have to make things darker than they actually are adjacent to the light source so that the light source can really shine. In a similar way, you could also gray things down next to a very colorful flower petal to make it look as colorful as you see it, even though you can never match the true color with the limitation of your pigments. And especially in cases like these where you're not really sure how you're gonna approach something, it's, I think, very helpful to make a color study before actually starting the painting. Really smart to invest a little bit of time into figuring out the things instead of wasting a lot of time with a bigger and more expensive canvas, using more paint, and then realizing that you actually don't know how to approach this thing, and perhaps you should have already done something to resolve the problem in a previous stage of painting, in the underpainting for example. Often there might not be any problems like this in actual projects as you gain experience, since you already pretty much usually have an idea on how to approach the subject and know the limitations of your paints as you're familiar with them. I think it is especially helpful to make a color study every time you're approaching a new subject though. In the end as well, I think it is smart to make this color study because it might actually make your whole painting process just a bit faster in the end, since you already figured out a lot of things and you can just execute them on the big painting. You might also consider it a rehearsal run for that. So for example, if you were to make a 40-hour painting and you were just to dive head on into painting the big thing, you might face some problems that need a bit of thought before they allow you to proceed with the painting process. Now you can always figure those things out in there, but you also have a bit more freedom when you're doing those in the color study stage, as you're not risking ruining the big painting you've already worked hard on. Now if you were to make, say, a 2-3 hour color study beforehand and you have these things figured out, you can just paint how you already kind of visioned it on the color study, and you might actually end up painting the whole thing in 35 hours, let's say, saving a couple hours in the entire process. This is of course speculative, but I believe that's more or less how it might work, because honestly figuring these things out does take a bit of time, and working on a smaller scale lets you figure out big relationships with little amounts of paint and effort, basically in faster times. Now, not to mention the benefits I've discussed before here, but as an added bonus, of course if you like the smaller scale painting, even if you sell the large piece in the end, which is a goal for many artists of course, then you can keep the smaller painting as a memory for yourself from the project you made, or you can sell it for an additional profit if you like to do that, and the color study is something you put some effort into. Sometimes my color studies are only like an hour or two, where I figure out more like the color composition of the image instead of figuring out details, and those are some things I even make in sketchbooks, where I'm definitely not looking to sell them afterwards, but in sketchbooks I can keep them as a nice reminder of some past projects. So this has been a lot of talk about this color study stuff, and in the future I think I will definitely be making color studies for bigger projects like the one I'm kind of planning here. It's always a helpful step. That said, for things like couple hour alla prima paintings or paintings I just do for fun, I probably won't be doing color studies, as it's just not worth the effort. And sometimes discovering while painting can actually be a fun part of the process. This color study is for a painting that is probably gonna be a part of a bigger series that I'm currently slowly putting together as I'm gathering reference and planning out those paintings. Let's hope I can display those bigger paintings in a gallery or a show in the future, but time will tell. Alright, that's it for today, and thanks for watching and listening to my rambling once again. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave them below or send me a DM on Instagram. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff.